When I received the news that I had inherited my great-uncle Lars's country house in Sweden, my emotions were conflicted. A part of me craved the peace of solitude, but another part bristled at the thought of such isolation. Still, curiosity won. The house, perched on the edge of a lake called Svartvatten, black water, was as beautiful as it was foreboding. The lake's surface gleamed like dark glass, so perfectly still it felt unnatural. The surrounding forest, dense with towering pines, seemed to press in closer the longer I stared. The nearest village, Forsvik, could have been plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. Red and white wooden houses clustered around a church with a steeple that pierced the sky. But its charm felt brittle, as though a strange weight hung over the place. The villagers were polite but cautious, their smiles brief, their eyes sliding away when I looked too long. It felt like being in a room where everyone knew a secret they refused to share. The first time I heard about the ceremony was at a dimly lit bakery where I was buying bread. Two elderly women sat in the corner, speaking Swedish in hushed, urgent tones. Their words rolled like distant thunder, but one phrase cut through: the lake and the summer sacrifice. A chill licked the back of my neck. I tried to focus on the cashier's hands as she counted change, but I couldn't shake the weight of those words. Outside, I approached a middle-aged man leaning against the wall, puffing on a cigarette. His face, weathered like old leather, creased into something unreadable when I mentioned the women's conversation. "Oh, it's just a tradition, a kind of celebration to thank nature," he said, his tone flat, his eyes avoiding mine. His fingers tightened around the cigarette until it bent, ash trembling on the verge of falling. There was more. I could feel it. Something unspoken. Something they all knew but wouldn't say. Back at the house, I tried to settle into the quiet, but the nights in Svartvatten weren't comforting. The silence felt unnatural, heavy, as if the lake itself was watching. Even the occasional creak of the house seemed amplified, like a breath drawn too close. A few days later, I met Thomas while fishing on the pier. His warm smile and casual demeanor were a relief after the villagers' guarded politeness. We talked about the lake, the forest, and the best spots for hiking. But when I casually mentioned the ceremony, his face froze mid-smile. It was as if I'd touched a live wire. "You should stay away from that," he said quietly, his voice suddenly tense. "Just trust me. Don't go near the lake on that day." Before I could ask more, he excused himself, his retreat almost frantic. That was when I realized Svartvatten hid more than its still water suggested. As the days passed, I noticed a pattern that gnawed at me. Any mention of the lake or the ceremony made the villagers visibly uneasy. They'd go quiet, avert their eyes, or steer the conversation elsewhere. One afternoon, wandering through the forest near the lake, I stumbled across something that made my skin crawl. Hidden among the trees was a moss-covered stone altar. It might have been forgotten by time, if not for the recent signs of use. Wilted flowers lay scattered around it, their stems broken like they'd been gripped too hard. Candles, burned to stubs, clung to the rock with melted wax, and at its center was a dark stain, rust brown and flaking, dried blood. My stomach churned, and I stepped back, feeling as though I'd just intruded on something ancient and forbidden. When I mentioned the altar to Thomas later that day, his face drained of color. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Forget about it, for your own good." His eyes darted around, as if someone might overhear. I tried to press him, but he cut me off, standing abruptly and leaving without another word. That night, the dreams began. I found myself in the lake, its waters black and thick like oil, swallowing all light. Something unseen gripped my ankles, pulling me down. No matter how hard I fought, the surface grew farther away, the air in my lungs burning as I clawed for freedom. I woke with a jolt, gasping, my body slick with sweat. The silence around me felt wrong, as if it were listening. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the porch. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing, yet the sound persisted, moving to the side of the house. When I finally worked up the nerve to look, I froze. Deep, jagged scratches marred the wood, fresh enough that splinters still curled along the edges. They were too large for any animal I could think of. I told myself they'd been there all along, but the lie didn't sit right. After that, the silence wasn't just unsettling. It felt alive. The house, the lake, even the trees seemed to hum with a presence, as though waiting. The end of the month arrived faster than I expected, bringing with it the ceremony. The village, usually quiet, buzzed with an eerie energy. People moved with purpose, carrying lanterns, ropes, and strange ornaments that glinted dully in the waning light. There was no music, no chatter, only the shuffle of feet and the low murmur of the wind through the trees. I followed them at a distance, careful to stay in the shadows. As they approached the lake, a chill ran down my spine. The procession felt wrong, like something out of a memory I wasn't supposed to have. When I reached the shore, my stomach twisted at the sight before me. The villagers had formed a circle around a ring of torches, their flickering light casting long, distorted shadows on the water. They stood motionless, heads bowed, murmuring in unison as if in prayer. In the center of the circle knelt a frail-looking man, his shoulders hunched and trembling. His eyes, wide with terror, were locked on the lake, his lips moving silently. He didn't seem to be there by choice. Then a sound broke the air, a deep, resonant moan that seemed to rise from the lake itself. It wasn't natural. It was a sound you felt in your bones. The villagers' murmurs swelled into a low, hypnotic chant. The melody slithered into my mind, disorienting me, twisting my thoughts until I couldn't tell where I was. My vision blurred, and the ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. A scream jolted me back. The man in the circle was clawing at the ground, his body dragged toward the water by an invisible force. His nails raked the dirt, leaving raw streaks of red behind. For a split second, I saw it. Something dark and massive beneath the surface, a shape that shifted like smoke and water. Then it moved, a blur too fast to track, and the man was gone. His final cry cut off abruptly as the water swallowed him whole. The villagers didn't move. They stood like statues, faces blank, their eyes reflecting the torch's glow. But their relief was palpable, like they'd just unburdened themselves of a curse. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick as the dark water lapping at the shore. It felt alive, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could only move once the torches were extinguished, plunging the shore into blackness. I stumbled back through the forest, each step heavier than the last. The branches seemed to reach for me, scratching my arms, snagging my clothes. The air grew colder, thicker, pressing against my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the house. Once inside, I locked the door and bolted the windows. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. The melody still echoed in my head, a relentless buzz that refused to fade. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call the police, but there was no signal. The isolation of this place suddenly felt deliberate, as though it had been designed to trap me. I sat in the living room, all the lights blazing, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. Around 3 a.m, I heard them. Footsteps on the porch. They were heavy, deliberate, too loud to be an animal. My breath hitched as I gripped the knife tighter, willing myself to stay calm. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, straining to hear anything. When I finally peeked out the window, I saw only the lake, its surface darker than the sky above it. The next morning, Thomas came to my door. He didn't knock. He stood there, waiting, as though he knew I was watching. His face was drawn, his eyes clouded with something between worry and resignation. When I let him in, he spoke without preamble. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, and his shoulders sagged as if in relief. But his next words were laced with fear. "Now you understand why no one talks about it. Every summer, someone disappears. It's been this way for generations. We didn't choose this, but there's no way out." I asked what it was, but he only shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line. "If you want to live, leave before next summer." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with his warning. For the next few days, I scoured the attic for answers. Among a pile of old, dust-covered books, I found one that mentioned Schwartvatten. The settlers had called it a sacred place, but the details were maddeningly vague. One passage stood out. To maintain the balance, a sacrifice must be made. The words sent a chill down my spine, aligning too closely with what I had seen. The more I learned, the less I understood. And the more I feared that the lake wasn't finished with me. At that moment, standing by the lake, I realized something horrifying. The entire village lived for that balance. They knew what happened, accepted it, and kept it secret. Perhaps that's why no one ever left or moved away. They couldn't. They were part of it, bound to it. A week after the ceremony, I decided to take one last walk to the lake before leaving for good. The sky was a heavy blanket of gray, and the air felt oppressive, thick with moisture that clung to my skin. As I approached the shore, the water seemed darker than ever, an inky void that swallowed all light. It felt wrong, as though the lake had absorbed the life it had claimed and was holding it deep within. I stood there, staring, and the silence pressed against my ears. Then a soft ripple broke the surface, the faint sound of moving water, subtle yet deliberate. My breath hitched as a chill raced down my spine. There was no one else around, but I felt it, a presence, unseen but undeniable. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my body froze in place, my mind screaming at me to run. For a brief moment, I saw it, a shadow beneath the water, massive and shifting. It wasn't like any fish or animal I'd ever seen, and worse, it seemed to be watching me. Its movement was slow, deliberate, and predatory. My chest tightened, as if the air itself had turned solid. Then it was gone, slipping back into the depths. I didn't wait to see more. The spell broke, and I ran, branches snagging my clothes, as if the forest itself wanted to keep me there. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I was inside the house, slamming the door behind me. I grabbed my belongings, threw them into the car, and drove away without looking back. Even as I left Svartvatn behind, the feeling of being watched stayed with me, like an unseen thread tying me to the lake. That night, I stayed in a hotel in the nearest town, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lake, the shadows writhing beneath its surface, and the echo of that haunting melody. It felt as though it were vibrating somewhere deep in my skull, a part of me now. The next morning, I tried to contact the authorities. It's just a rural village, they said. They have old traditions, but they're harmless. Harmless. The word rattled in my mind, absurd and meaningless. I knew no one would believe me. Svartvatn protected its secrets, not just through the villagers, but through something intangible, an invisible barrier that kept the truth from escaping. Months have passed, but the images haven't faded. Sometimes I wake up drenched in sweat, certain I'm back at the lake, its dark waters pulling me down. Every time I hear the sound of running water, whether in the sink, the shower, or the rain pounding on the windows, the fear returns, washing over me like a wave. My chest tightens, and I have to remind myself that I'm far away, though it never feels far enough. I haven't told anyone else what happened, aside from writing this account, because I know how it sounds. Like the ramblings of someone who's lost their grip on reality. But I know the truth. Svartvatn is not just a lake. It's alive. It watches, it waits, and it takes. And even now, far from its shores, I feel its grip, faint but unyielding. Leaving was not enough. Some part of me stayed behind, and I fear that one day it will call me back. I've never been the type to fit in easily, so when the popular kids from my new school invited me to a camping trip, I didn't know what to feel. They were nice enough, but I couldn't shake the sense that I didn't belong. Still, I went, telling myself it was a chance to blend in. Everyone had been buzzing about the lake, the way they spoke of it, half in awe and half in hushed whispers, made it seem like more than just a scenic spot. It had an eerie pull, the kind of place that feels alive with secrets. The campsite was in a remote stretch of wilderness, the kind of place where the trees tower over you like watchful sentinels. The lake itself was vast and still, its dark surface reflecting the sky in a way that felt too perfect, like it was hiding something beneath. As the group gathered around the campfire that night, the conversation turned to the stories surrounding the lake. Someone mentioned tragic accidents, their tone too casual for the weight of the subject. I tried to brush it off, but a chill crept over me, and I felt my stomach tighten. Still, I didn't want to seem scared in front of them. Night fell fast, and the shadows of the trees pressed in closer. The mood shifted when one of the boys, grinning as if he'd just thought of the greatest joke, suggested we take the boat out on the lake. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the others laughed and started to goad each other, something felt wrong. Their excitement had an edge to it, like they were daring the darkness to push back. That's when I noticed her. One of the girls, who'd been sitting quietly the whole time, was staring at the lake. She was always on the fringe of the group, the weird one, the kind who never seemed to care about fitting in. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke, but it carried an unsettling weight. "You shouldn't mess around out there," she said, her eyes never leaving the water. "The currents, they've taken people before. There was an accident years ago. Someone died." The laughter faltered for a moment, and an awkward silence hung in the air. Then the joke started again, louder this time, as if to drown her out. "Come on, stop being so dramatic," one of the boys said, rolling his eyes. Another chimed in. "What? Are you scared of a little water?" She didn't respond. Her gaze stayed fixed on the lake, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I felt the urge to ask her more, to press for details. There was something about the way she spoke, as though she wasn't just repeating a story. She'd lived it. But the others were already moving, dragging the boat toward the water, their laughter echoing too loudly in the stillness. I hesitated, a cold knot forming in my chest. The firelight flickered, and for a second, the lake seemed darker, its surface rippling faintly, though no wind stirred the air. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right, but I pushed the thought down. I couldn't be the one to ruin the night, not after finally getting invited. So, against my better judgment, I followed them to the shore. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, a spooky tale to liven up a camping trip. Every place has its legends, right? But as I stood on the shore, watching the group push the boat into the lake, a heaviness settled over me. The quiet girl's warning echoed in my mind, and the dark water seemed to ripple with an unspoken threat. The boys laughed as they climbed aboard, their voices loud and mocking, as if trying to drown out their own unease. I lingered at the edge, feeling the cold air bite my skin, and told myself it was fine. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The boat drifted out, its lights flickering against the inky water. For a moment, all seemed calm. Then came the scream, a raw, desperate sound that tore through the night. My chest tightened, and my breath caught as I froze, staring at the lake. The group's laughter twisted into frantic shouts, their voices rising in panic. I saw the boat lurch violently, rocking back and forth as if something was pulling it from below. Before I could fully process what was happening, it capsized, plunging its passengers into the freezing water. Another scream followed, piercing and anguished, before cutting off abruptly. Then silence, so complete it felt like the lake had swallowed the sound itself. The stillness was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. My legs wouldn't move, and my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I could only watch as the water lapped gently at the overturned boat, faint cries for help fading into nothing. The group on the shore erupted into chaos. Some ran toward the trees, their panic driving them away from the scene. Others shouted incoherently, their fear louder than their concern. One boy bolted back to the campfire, pretending like nothing had happened. No one tried to help those still in the water. I wanted to scream at them, to do something, but I couldn't move. That's when I saw her, the quiet girl. She stood motionless, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the boat's lights. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were locked on the lake, the spot where the boat had capsized. She didn't look shocked or afraid. Instead, she seemed resigned, like she'd been expecting this all along. When her gaze finally turned to me, something unspoken passed between us. I wanted to ask her what she knew, but before I could, the group scattered completely, vanishing into the forest like shadows. The lake returned to its eerie stillness, its surface reflecting the moonlight as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a prank gone wrong. It was a choice, though whose choice it was, I couldn't say. I stayed longer than I should have, frozen by fear and disbelief. When I finally summoned the courage to approach the shoreline, the place was deserted. The boat, the screams, the group, they were all gone, leaving behind only the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. The night stretched on endlessly, and the darkness around me deepened, thick and impenetrable. The quiet girl's warning echoed in my mind, and I knew this was no mere accident. Something far more sinister lay beneath the surface of that lake. The next day, no one spoke of what had happened. The quiet girl vanished from the group, as if she'd never been there at all. The others carried on with their usual routine, laughing and pretending like nothing had changed. But I saw them differently now. I had seen their true faces, their fear, their selfishness, their willingness to abandon each other when things went wrong. The lake didn't just reveal the cracks in their friendship. It pulled them apart, stripped them of their masks. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew the lake wasn't done with us. It held more than secrets beneath its surface. It held power. And even now, I wonder if that night was only the beginning. I've never been able to forget that scream. It wasn't just the sound. It was the sheer, desperate finality of it. The kind of cry that stays with you, echoing in the quiet corners of your mind long after it's gone. That night left a mark on me that time hasn't erased. The group moved on, burying the memory beneath laughter and false smiles, pretending it never happened. But I couldn't forget. I knew the truth. The boy who drowned didn't deserve that end. None of us did. Yet, in the silence that followed, I realized something chilling. If it had been anyone else in the water, the rest of us would have acted the same. Running, hiding, abandoning. The quiet girl who tried to warn us disappeared without a trace. No one asked where she went, and no one cared. It was as though she had never existed, her warning swallowed by the same silence that claimed the boy. To this day, I don't know what happened to her, but I can't shake the feeling that she knew more about that lake than she let on. Maybe she never left at all. Something was waiting for us in that lake, something far deeper, far darker than any of us could face. It wasn't just the water or the currents. It was the lake itself. It had a presence, a weight that pressed into you, made you feel small, insignificant. And once you felt its gaze, you couldn't escape it. Not completely. I carry that night with me. Every time I see someone pretending to belong, faking a connection they don't truly feel, I think of the group's frantic escape. I think of the silence, the selfishness, and how quickly people reveal their cruelty when faced with fear. The lake never really left me. No matter how many years pass, whenever someone mentions camping or isolated lakes, a shiver runs through me. It's like I can still feel the cold grip of the air that night, the way the water seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark, pulling everything into its depths. The memory haunts me, but what scares me most is knowing the lake hasn't forgotten me either. Sometimes, in the still of the night, I hear faint echoes of that scream, distant, warped, like it's rising from underwater. Other times, I wake from dreams of black water lapping at my feet, of shadows moving beneath the surface. I try to shake it off, tell myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know better. The lake doesn't let go. It holds on to you, drags you back, even if only in your mind. And as much as I try to move on, I know that part of me will always be tethered to that place, because the lake remembers. It remembers the boy, the girl, the choices we made that night. And I can't help but wonder if one day it will call me back. Since Pedro started hanging out with that group, something had shifted in him. He was never the adventurous type. His idea of excitement was watching movies at home, not trekking through the wilderness. So when he told me he'd be hiking a forest trail with his new friends, it felt off. I couldn't explain why, but the thought unsettled me. It wasn't jealousy or overprotectiveness. It was more like an alarm sounding in the back of my mind for no reason at all. When I insisted on coming along, Pedro resisted, brushing me off with a laugh. "It's just a hike," he said, "nothing serious." But the idea of him going without me gnawed at me. I told him I needed exercise, that it'd be fun to tag along, and eventually, my stubbornness won. By Saturday afternoon, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon as we joined his group and set off on the trail. Pedro's friends were loud and carefree, cracking jokes and snapping endless photos of themselves against the fading light. They didn't seem to notice the stillness of the forest, the way the shadows stretched long across the path. Among them was Matthias, a boy who had always made me uneasy. He was quiet, reserved, and carried himself with a kind of tension, as if something unseen weighed on his shoulders. During the hike, I couldn't help but watch him. His eyes flicked constantly to the trees, his head turning sharply at the slightest rustle. At first, I thought he was just jumpy, but there was something more, an intensity in his gaze, as if he were scanning for something specific. His movements were jerky, deliberate, like he was trying to hide something from the group. The others didn't notice. They laughed too loudly, their voices breaking the quiet of the woods in a way that felt wrong, intrusive. But I felt it, the heaviness in the air, the way the forest seemed to press in closer the farther we walked. Each step deepened the pit in my stomach, an instinctual dread I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, that it was silly to feel this way on a simple hike. But every time Matthias glanced over his shoulder, his face drawn and pale, I knew something was wrong. I told myself it was just a walk in the woods. That's all it was, wasn't it? But the deeper we went, the harder it became to ignore the feeling clawing its way up my spine, the sense that something was watching us from the shadows. As we continued along the trail, the group began to spread out, their chatter echoing faintly through the trees. Some darted ahead, laughing and snapping photos, while others lagged behind, more absorbed in their phones than the path. I stayed close to Pedro, but he seemed distracted, drawn toward his friends and their carefree energy. I couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at me. Matthias, walking apart from the others, only made it worse. His steps were slow and deliberate, as if the weight of something unseen pressed down on him. At one point, he strayed off the trail entirely. I caught a glimpse of his hands, cradling something small and glinting, but he quickly tucked it away when he realized I was watching. It wasn't just Matthias that made me uneasy. The forest itself felt different. The further we went, the quieter it became, as though the trees were swallowing all sound. Even the birds had fallen silent, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the crunch of our footsteps. The air grew heavier, dense and still, like a storm waiting to break. Then Matthias disappeared into the trees. He wandered off the main trail, veering into the shadows without so much as a word. No one noticed except me. "Pedro," I called, tugging his arm. "We've gone far enough. Let's head back. It's getting late." Pedro shrugged me off with a casual laugh. "It's no big deal. Matthias does this all the time." The answer unsettled me more. If this was normal, why didn't anyone seem concerned? I wanted to argue, to insist we leave, but Pedro was already moving ahead with the others. I didn't want to leave him alone. So I followed, the forest closing in tighter with every step. The path narrowed, and the air grew colder, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. When we caught sight of Matthias again, he was standing in a clearing up ahead. The group approached slowly, their chatter dying as they saw him. Matthias stood completely still, his back to us, staring intently at something on the ground. His lips moved, whispering too softly for me to make out the words. The clearing felt wrong. The air there was different, thicker, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. "Hey, Matthias," Pedro called out, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" Matthias turned toward him slowly, his expression blank. His gaze was distant, empty, but something in his eyes made my stomach twist. Then I saw it, the knife in his hand. A small camping blade, but its edge gleamed strangely in the dim light, almost unnaturally sharp. The group froze, the tension snapping into silence. No one knew what to say. Matthias slid the knife into his pocket like it was nothing, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned and began walking again without a word, leaving us behind in the clearing. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared ask him what he was doing or why he had the knife. The carefree energy of the hike was gone, replaced by a simmering tension. I moved closer to Pedro, whispering, "We need to leave." Now. He hesitated, looking torn, but before he could respond, a sharp noise split the air. A loud crack, like a branch snapping under pressure, followed by a scream that froze my blood. It was raw, desperate, and too close for comfort. My heart leapt into my throat as the group turned toward the sound, wide-eyed and pale. Whatever it was coming from the direction Matthias had gone. The scream was so sharp, so raw. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It froze us in place, like prey caught in a predator's gaze. My instincts battled each other, run toward the sound or away from it, but my legs wouldn't move. Pedro, stubborn as ever, made the decision for me. He darted into the trees, chasing after Matthias before I could stop him. My gut twisted, but I couldn't leave him. I followed, the sound of breaking branches and frantic rustling growing louder with every step. We stumbled onto the trail again, and there it was, Matthias's knife, lying on the ground. its blade glinting faintly in the fading light. Around it, the soil was disturbed, clawed with deep gouges as if something or someone had been dragged. My breath caught as I scanned the area. There was no sign of Matthias. Silence fell. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. This was heavier, suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. We called out for Matthias, our voices echoing uselessly into the trees, but there was no response. When the rest of the group caught up, their faces were pale and wide-eyed, but no one dared to venture further. The sun was slipping below the horizon, and the forest seemed to grow darker by the second, swallowing the trail ahead. I urged everyone to turn back, my voice shaking. But Matthias's friends hesitated. Their guilt was palpable, yet none of them had the courage to step forward. It wasn't until I threatened to call for help that they relented. The trek back was agonizingly slow, the group quiet except for the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. Pedro didn't speak a word. His face was drawn, his eyes distant, as if he were replaying the afternoon over and over in his mind. When we finally emerged from the forest, the tension clung to us like a second skin. Back home, Pedro sat in silence, visibly shaken. I tried to stay calm for his sake, but my mind was racing. I called Matthias's parents, but there was no answer. Not long after, word began to spread. Matthias was missing. That night, a search party was organized. Volunteers, police, even tracking dogs. I wanted to join, but Pedro's anxiety kept me home. He barely spoke, his answers short and disjointed, until finally he broke down. Tears streaked his face as he admitted that something had been off about Matthias all afternoon. He'd noticed it, but brushed it off, thinking it was just Matthias being himself. Hours later, the call came. They'd found Matthias, or what was left of him. His body was at the bottom of a ravine, not far from where we'd heard the scream. The authorities said it was an accident, that he must have wandered off, slipped, and fallen. But their explanation didn't sit right with me. The knife, the marks in the soil, the scream, it didn't add up. That sound wasn't the kind of noise someone makes when falling. It was primal, desperate, like something had torn its way out of him. Pedro didn't want to know the details. He locked himself in his room, staring blankly at the wall for hours, his mind clearly wrestling with what had happened. I didn't press him. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to think about it either. But the image of Matthias standing in that clearing, the vacant stare in his eyes, and the strange gleam of the knife wouldn't leave my mind. The official story was simple. An accident. Case closed. But something in that forest was left unexplained. The silence, the scream, the way the air had felt heavy with something unseen. Whatever it was, it stayed with me long after that night, creeping into my thoughts, whenever the wind rustles through trees or shadows stretch long in the fading light. Some part of me knows that Matthias's death wasn't just an accident. Something in those woods wanted him, and I can't shake the feeling that, even now, it's waiting for more. In the days that followed, the authorities closed off the forest while they conducted their investigation. The official conclusion came quickly. Matthias's death was an accident, a tragic misstep in the wilderness. But I couldn't accept it. The vacant look in Matthias's eyes in the clearing, the way the air had thickened into an unnatural silence, and that scream. It all felt wrong, like puzzle pieces from a picture I couldn't quite see. Whenever I tried to talk about it with Pedro, he would shake his head, mumble something about not wanting to remember, and change the subject. The guilt weighed on him, and I could see it in his every movement. It was as if he believed he could have prevented it, if only he'd done something differently. The truth is, I felt the same. Maybe if I'd insisted harder that we leave, maybe if I'd confronted Matthias about the knife, or stopped Pedro from running into the woods. But who could have imagined that day would end the way it did? Even now, I can't go near that forest. Just the thought of it sends a shiver down my spine. There's something about it, something that sticks to you, no matter how far away you are. Pedro stopped hiking altogether and drifted away from the group of friends he once seemed so eager to impress. When someone mentions Matthias, he forces a sad smile and turns the conversation elsewhere. The shadow of that day lingers over both of us, a weight we can't quite shake, no matter how much we try to move on. I still replay the details in my mind sometimes, trying to make sense of them. Matthias standing in the clearing, the knife in his hand, the eerie quiet of the forest, the scream that seemed to split the air itself. The investigators called it an accident, but I know better. There was something in that forest, something watching, waiting. And when it came for Matthias, it didn't leave behind answers, only questions. What frightens me most isn't just what happened that day. It's the sense that the forest remembers. It feels like a living thing, something ancient and unknowable, holding its secrets deep within the shadows of its trees. I can feel it, even now, when the wind brushes through the trees outside my window, or when the air grows still and heavy without reason. Don't know what really happened in that forest, and I doubt I ever will. But I'm certain of one thing. Whatever claimed Matthias that day wasn't finished. The forest isn't a place you leave behind. It stays with you, lurking in the edges of your mind, a shadow you can't escape. And some part of me knows, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that it's still waiting. I've always thought of myself as a calm person, drawn to the quiet corners of life. That's why I chose this tranquil neighborhood in Buenos Aires, with its tree-lined streets and a stillness that felt like it belonged to another time. It seemed perfect, a place where the world's chaos could never intrude. But shortly after moving in, I began to notice something odd about my neighbor in the apartment next door. There was something about him that made my skin prickle. He came and went at the strangest hours, always in a rush, as though he was running from something or to something. His movements were sharp, his energy jittery, like a taut wire ready to snap. Morning, afternoon, or the dead of night. It didn't matter. He was always hurrying, clutching bags or packages that he shielded from view. I told myself I was imagining things, but the air around him felt charged with something unspoken, something that seeped through the walls and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. That night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just settled in with a cup of tea, trying to unwind from a long day, when the noises began. They weren't the usual sounds of a neighbor's life, the muffled hum of a TV or the clatter of dishes. These were different. Hurried footsteps pounded across the floor. Furniture scraped against the walls, and beneath it all, a muffled, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy being dragged. It wasn't just noise. It was frantic, almost panicked. The longer it went on, the more I felt like I was suffocating in my own home. My patience snapped. Before I could think it through, I was on my feet, the cup of tea forgotten on the table. I needed to know what was happening. I stepped into the hallway, my heart racing. His door was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling onto the carpet. I froze. A chill ran through me as I glanced up and down the empty corridor. There was no one else around, only the silence pressing in on me. My stomach twisted as I stared at the gap in the door. For a moment, I hesitated. This wasn't normal. I shouldn't be doing this. But the noises still echoed in my head, and my curiosity burned too brightly to ignore. Slowly, I stepped closer. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, the sound like a shout in the stillness. I slipped inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air was different here, heavier, staler, carrying a faint, metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. The dim hallway stretched ahead of me, lit only by a flickering bulb. I couldn't see much, but the noise had stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the chaos. It felt watchful, as if the apartment itself had paused to see what I would do next. I should have turned back. I should have left. But I didn't. Something inside me pushed forward, even as every instinct screamed at me to stop. As soon as I stepped into the apartment, the air hit me, thick, stale, and heavy, like a place that had been sealed off from life. The faint metallic tang made my stomach turn. The lighting was dim, with a single flickering bulb in the hallway casting unsettling shadows that danced across the walls. My footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence, each one a reminder that I shouldn't be there. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Something compelled me forward, as though the answer to an unspoken question lay just ahead. The hallway opened into the living room, and I froze. The space was chaos. Papers littered the floor, scattered like they'd been thrown in a panic. Boxes lay open, their contents spilling out. Documents, odd trinkets, things that seemed to hold significance I couldn't decipher. A laptop sat on a table, its screen glowing eerily in the dim light. As I moved closer, I saw images of documents displayed on the screen, technical diagrams, codes, and charts. I didn't understand what they were, but it didn't matter. The implications were clear. My neighbor was involved in something far from ordinary. My breath quickened as I scanned the room. The air felt charged, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then it hit me, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and my chest tightened as the realization settled in. I wasn't alone. I turned toward the door, my movements deliberate and slow, trying to suppress the rising panic. The door felt so far away, but I knew I had to leave before whoever was here returned. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but when I turned it, it wouldn't budge. The lock was engaged. Then I heard it, the softest creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. He was there, standing in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the faint light from the hallway. My neighbor. His gaze was cold, piercing, and utterly calm. There was no anger, no surprise, just a terrifying stillness, as if he had been expecting me. Room seemed to shrink around us. The weight of his stare pinned me in place, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the intensity in his eyes made me feel like I was being torn apart, examined piece by piece. And then a chilling realization struck me. It felt like more than just him watching, as if something unseen was also present, its gaze crawling over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Finally, he broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice steady, almost kind. But there was no mistaking the warning beneath his words. I tried to respond, to explain, but my mouth felt dry, my voice caught in my throat. He didn't try to stop me from leaving. He just stood there, unmoving, watching with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper, as though I were part of a plan I couldn't begin to understand. Then, as if deciding something silently, he stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. But his gaze didn't waver, and the moment felt far from over. I hesitated, unable to shake the feeling that leaving wasn't an escape. It was a beginning. The air buzzed with tension, and as I stepped past him, the weight of his stare followed me, lingering long after I was gone. I left the apartment as quickly as I could, my legs trembling with every step. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it would give me away. When I finally reached my own door and locked it behind me, the relief was fleeting. The walls of my apartment, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed paper-thin, offering no real protection. Every creak, every distant footstep sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't stop replaying the moment his eyes met mine. That calm, knowing gaze haunted me, a silent reminder that I had seen too much. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleeplessness. I sat by the window, listening to the faint hum of the street below, my mind spinning. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, some bizarre coincidence, but I couldn't. I knew deep down that I had stumbled into something far darker than I could comprehend. The next day, everything changed. I was at work, trying to shove the memory into some distant corner of my mind, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "This is the Buenos Aires police," the voice on the other end said, calm but firm. "We need you to come to the station." My stomach dropped. The officer explained little, only that I was a key witness in an ongoing investigation involving my neighbor. Fear and confusion churned in my chest as I made my way to the station. There, the gravity of the situation hit me like a cold wave. My neighbor had been under surveillance for weeks, the officer said. Everything I'd witnessed, the strange behavior, the documents on his laptop, was part of a much larger operation to dismantle a sprawling criminal network. They asked me about the night before, about what I'd seen and heard. The questions seemed routine, almost clinical, but the weight of the situation pressed down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was out of my depth, caught in a web far more dangerous than I could grasp. The officers were cautious with their words, as if even they couldn't fully explain the scope of what they were dealing with. In the following weeks, I was called back to the station multiple times. Each visit made the situation feel more surreal, as if my life had been hijacked by something far beyond my control. I became a reluctant observer to a world I didn't understand, a world of clandestine networks, hidden operations, and dangers that seemed to ripple just beneath the surface of everyday life. The raid happened during one of these visits. As I sat in the station's waiting room, tension buzzed in the air like static electricity. Officers moved with purpose, their expressions grim. When the news came in, it felt like the climax of a story I hadn't wanted to be part of. The police stormed my neighbor's apartment, seizing papers, equipment, and devices. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with urgency, but I could pick up fragments, words like network, operations, and classified. The neighbor was taken away, his face as calm and inscrutable as it had been that night. I never saw him again, never learned what became of him. The investigation, as vast and incomprehensible as it seemed, abruptly disappeared from my life. The police thanked me, told me not to speak about it, and sent me home, but I couldn't forget. To this day, the thought of that night sends a shiver down my spine. I don't know how close I came to being swallowed whole by whatever shadowy world my neighbor was part of. The fragments I saw, the scattered papers, the cryptic laptop screen, his chillingly calm demeanor, feel like pieces of a puzzle I'll never solve. And maybe that's for the best. What haunts me most is not the questions left unanswered, but the quiet realization that I was a part of something far bigger than myself, something dangerous, something still out there, watching, waiting. After that day, life went on, but it was never the same. The police never shared details about the case or what became of my neighbor. Their silence left me stranded in a fog of unanswered questions. I felt like a pawn in a game too large to comprehend, my role insignificant yet deeply unsettling. I never learned what he was truly involved in, nor why I had been drawn into it. But I knew one thing for certain. He was tied to something dangerous, a shadowy network that operated far beyond the reach of ordinary life. I returned to my routine, but the city felt different, darker, even in the daylight. The bustling streets that once felt alive now seemed fraught with hidden dangers. Tree-lined parks and quiet cafes carried an undercurrent of menace, as though the calm could shatter at any moment. Every unfamiliar face, every glance that lingered too long, made my chest tighten. I couldn't stop asking myself, why me? What did he want from me? Was my involvement truly accidental, or had I stumbled too close to something I was never meant to see? The lack of closure gnawed at me. The cycle of events ended as abruptly as it began, leaving me with no explanations, no goodbyes, and no one to tell me why it had all happened. I was discarded, a forgotten detail in the margins of a dark and secret story. Yet the fear stayed with me, growing roots deep in my mind. I couldn't shake the sense that somewhere, someone else was still searching for answers about that case. Someone who might not be content with the police's conclusions. I never saw my neighbor again, and I never tried to find out what happened to him. Some questions are better left unanswered, but the fear lingers. It clings to me in quiet moments, in the way my eyes flick to shadows that don't move, or in the silence that sometimes feels too heavy, too watchful. It's the fear of not knowing how close I came to being consumed by that dark world, or worse, how easily it could all happen again. Even now, as I try to rebuild a sense of normalcy, I can't escape the feeling that the story isn't truly over. Somewhere in the cracks of this city or beyond, the pieces of that hidden network are still moving, unseen and unfathomable. And though I've tried to leave it all behind, I know it hasn't left me. The edges of my world remain blurred, haunted by a darkness I can't fully understand, but will always feel pressing just out of sight. When I moved into the building, I didn't know anyone. It was the kind of place you'd call peaceful. Quiet halls, soft hums of distant traffic, and the occasional creak of old pipes. After years in a noisy, chaotic part of town, I thought I'd finally found the calm I'd been craving. The first neighbor I met was Greg. He lived next door, thin, middle-aged, with a mop of hair just starting to gray at the temples. His smile was easy but restrained, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. When we crossed paths in the hallway that first time, he said, "You'll like it here. It's quiet. People keep to themselves." He wasn't wrong. In that moment, I felt an odd comfort in his words, though something about the way he lingered before turning to go seemed almost calculated. For the next few weeks, we'd exchange pleasantries in passing, quick conversations about the weather, or how work was keeping him busy at the mechanic shop down the street. Greg wasn't unfriendly, far from it, but there was something impenetrable about him. He was like the silence in the building, a little too perfect, a little too empty. Then he disappeared. At first, it didn't seem strange. I'd gotten used to his routine, his door opening early in the morning and closing late in the afternoon. Sometimes I'd hear the faint roar of a soccer match through the wall. But then the days stretched into weeks. His apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. Walking past his door, I'd feel the hairs on my arms lift, though I told myself it was just my imagination. And then the smell started. It was faint at first, a sweet, cloying scent that lingered just outside his door. It reminded me of rotting fruit left too long in the sun, though there was something else underneath it, something damp and sour. The first time I noticed it, I stopped mid-step, my stomach flipping as if I'd walked into a wall. I forced myself to keep moving, muttering that it was probably the plumbing. These old buildings always had quirks, right? But the smell grew worse. By the second week, it was unmistakable, thick and suffocating. It clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe when I walked by his door. I avoided that part of the hallway when I could. But in the late afternoon, when the air grew still and heavy, the scent seemed to seep into the walls. I mentioned it to another neighbor once, hoping they'd noticed it too, but they just shrugged. "Greg's a private guy," they said, as if that explained everything. It didn't. And that sweet, sickly smell was starting to feel like it didn't want me to forget it. I knocked on Greg's door again, harder this time. "Greg, are you in there?" My voice echoed down the empty hallway, swallowed by the thick silence. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for anything. A shuffle, a faint cough, the buzz of a TV, but there was nothing. Just that smell, heavier now, seeping into the air like it had a life of its own. I stepped back, uneasy. He had to be in there, right? It was starting to bother me more than I wanted to admit. I went to the building manager, a sharp-eyed woman with a perpetual air of disinterest. When I explained the situation, she waved it off, saying Greg was probably traveling. "He's a grown man," she said. "If it were urgent, he would have told someone." Her tone made it clear she didn't want to get involved. I walked away, feeling frustrated and a little embarrassed, but the pit in my stomach didn't go away. A few days later, the smell became unbearable. It wasn't just me noticing anymore. Other neighbors started whispering about it. "I saw flies near his door," one woman murmured, her voice trembling. That was when we decided enough was enough. Someone called the police. When the officers arrived, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Explaining everything to them made it all feel more real, more urgent. The building manager was dragged out of her office to unlock Greg's door with a spare key. Even before she turned the lock, the officers exchanged a look, their faces tense. That smell, it was everywhere now, suffocating and sickly sweet, clawing at the back of my throat. The moment the door opened, it hit us like a wall. One officer stepped back, coughing into his sleeve, while another covered his nose. The air inside was thick, humid, as if the apartment had been sealed off for weeks. The curtains were drawn, casting everything in a dim, hazy gloom. The officers switched on their flashlights, and beams of light darted around the room, illuminating the chaos within. And then I saw him. Greg's body was crumpled near the sofa, twisted in a way that made my stomach lurch. Even from the doorway, I could tell something was terribly, horribly wrong. His skin looked waxy, almost gray, and the sight of him in that state, the stillness, the grotesque angle of his limbs, made my knees weak. I turned away, my hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to retch. The officers moved in quickly, their voices low and urgent. One of them waved us back, telling us to return to our apartments, but no one did. We lingered in the hallway, huddled together like frightened animals. Some neighbors were crying softly. Others just stared at the floor, their faces pale and stricken. Whispers filled the air, questions, speculations, fragments of disbelief. How could no one have noticed? Someone muttered. How did this happen? As the forensic team arrived, one of the officers approached us. His expression was grim. This is now a homicide investigation, he said, his voice measured but heavy. There are signs of foul play. Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. Not only was Greg dead, he'd been murdered. The thought of someone doing that, here, in our building, and then slipping away without anyone noticing, it made my skin crawl. The hallway suddenly felt colder, darker, and as I stood there, surrounded by the murmurs and quiet sobs of my neighbors, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Someone had to have seen something. Someone had to have heard. So why did we all stay silent? The days that followed were a blur, like living in a dream you can't wake up from. The police were everywhere, their presence unsettling in our once quiet building. They knocked on every door, asking the same questions. When did you last see Greg? Did you notice anything unusual? Hear any noises? My answers felt hollow. The last time I saw him was weeks before, in the elevator. He'd been cheerful, chatting about a classic car he was restoring. I remember his smile vividly now, and it twists in my stomach because I can't reconcile that image with what I saw that day outside his apartment. Then the revelations came. Greg wasn't just a quiet, reserved mechanic. The police uncovered that he had a criminal record, a past he had apparently worked hard to leave behind. Hearing that was like being hit with a cold wind. I kept replaying every interaction we'd had, searching for some sign, some hint of darkness, but there was nothing. He was just Greg, polite and unassuming. It was almost impossible to believe he'd once been involved in illegal schemes. But the police said he had tried to turn his life around. That almost made it worse. Like he was running from a shadow he knew would eventually catch up to him. As the investigation deepened, so did the unease in the building. Rumors swirled, fed by the police's updates and our own whispered conversations. It turned out Greg's death wasn't random. Someone from his past had come for him, a former business partner, someone he'd betrayed years ago to save himself. The thought that it wasn't just violence but calculated vengeance chilled me. The police said there were clear signs of a struggle in his apartment. I kept imagining it, the sheer terror Greg must have felt. The fight, the moment he realized it was over. And then the worst thought. The killer had been in the building, walking the same halls as me, maybe even brushing past me without me knowing. That thought still keeps me awake some nights. The conclusion of the investigation didn't bring much comfort. They caught the man, a former associate of Greg's who'd been released from prison a few months earlier. Greg had turned him in years ago for a lighter sentence, and the betrayal had festered into something lethal. The man never confessed, but the evidence left no doubt. What terrified me most wasn't just the murder, but the cold efficiency with which it was carried out. Knowing someone could harbor that kind of hatred, plan it so methodically, and carry it out so brutally, it changed the way I saw people. It made me wonder what kind of rage, what kind of darkness might be simmering just below the surface of the people around me. Greg's death left a shadow over everything. I can't walk down the hallway without feeling it, the memory of that smell, the sight of the door now shut and empty, and the knowledge of what happened inside. I used to think you could know people, at least a little, even if it was just a neighborly smile or a passing conversation. But Greg taught me how much people can hide. Did he know this would happen? Was he living every day waiting for it, trying to outrun it? Those questions haunt me as much as the crime itself. I try to avoid that part of the building when I can, but sometimes I have to pass by. Each time, I feel it again. That chill that seeps into my bones like the hallway remembers. I can't say if it's fear or just the weight of memory. I wonder if I'll ever stop thinking about Greg, about what happened to him, and who he really was. Sometimes I tell myself I'll forget one day, that the feeling will fade. But deep down, I know it won't. Some things stay with you forever.